It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Charlie Moore. Charlie Moore is the founder and CEO of Rocket Lawyer Incorporated. His experience as an attorney representing startups exposed him to both the high cost and high value of legal advice. So he started Rocket Lawyer to deliver high value legal services at a price nearly everyone can afford. Today, Rocket Lawyer is one of the most widely used legal services in the world, with operations in the United States and the United Kingdom. Charlie has been engaged in internet law and business since beginning his career as an attorney at Venture Law Group in Menlo Park, California. He represented Yahoo as an IPO, Web TV Networks acquired by Microsoft, and Cerent Corporation acquired by Cisco Systems at a critical early stages, and was founded on the OnStation Corporation. Charlie graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy with his Bachelor's of Science degree. He graduated from the University of California at Berkeley with his Juris Doctorate, and he served in the U.S. Navy as an officer on the USNS Mercy and is a Gulf War veteran. We are so excited to have Charlie with us today to talk about emerging as a business. Charlie Moore, thank you.
All right, Karen, I am thrilled to be here with you. So first I want to thank Armand, Karen, the entire team at Pepperdine for having me. I also want to thank Ashley Bushnell, who I couldn't do this without, who's our head of communications at Rocket Lawyer. So as Karen said, I'm going to talk about emerging organizations and the incredible power for good that companies can be. And I know that might sound strange these days, but it's true. Just in the news today, the CDC is declaring that fully vaccinated people no longer need to wear masks, even inside. As we've seen with this pandemic, government can't do it alone. And now more than ever, communities are demanding that companies serve both the public good as well as pursuing profit. So, hey, let's talk about the background of companies, which I love, being a corporate lawyer before I started Rocket Lawyer. And so as defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, a corporation is a company or group of people authorized to act as a single entity, legally a person, and recognized as such in law. At its core, a corporation is established to provide protection for those who have a financial stake in a business, separating their personal assets from the debts and liabilities of the company. As such, corporations foster entrepreneurship, and in combination with modern bankruptcy laws, which Abraham Lincoln was a big proponent of, they facilitate risk-taking. Early humans engaged in trade at least 300,000 years ago. However, the corporation as we know it really took shape in the last 5 centuries. In the modern era, the corporation has evolved not just as a commercial enterprise with financial goals, but as a social entity with responsibilities to humanity itself. Now let's explore how we got here. So corporations in the fabric of history. While legal business entities existed prior to the 17th century, as I just noted, notably in parts of the Byzantine Empire and medieval Europe, the earliest corporations that are familiar to most people are the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, which were both formed to trade in the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. Approved in 1600 under a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I, the British East India Company was formed by a group of merchants using their pooled investments, the early venture capitalists, which in their proposal were the sums that they would adventure for their voyage. With the same destination in mind, the Dutch East India Company was established all the way back in 1602. Now, one big differentiator for the Dutch company over the British company was that it offered shares to the general public, making it what many people consider to be the first publicly traded corporation. Now, for all of their innovation, companies were also problematic, operating with quasi-governmental power instigating wars and colonization and relying on slave labor. They were part of the problem. Now, a monopoly in the eyes of the British colonial subjects who were otherwise restricted from legally participating in the tea trade, the British East India Company was a precursor to the monopolies established on American soil during the Gilded Age of the 19th century. In that period, a wave of corporations and business leaders would act in a manner that their critics would call overly rapacious and ruthless to establish monopolies over industries like steel and oil. Labeled robber barons, businessmen like Jay Gould, Andrew Carnegie, and of course, John D. Rockefeller became known for their aggressive tactics initially, but later they became known for their philanthropy. Now, fast forward to our modern era, which many think has strong parallels with that Gilded Age of yesteryear. Today, corporations are under increasing scrutiny from search engines with massive market share. Full disclosure, we're a big Google partner. Google Ventures is one of our investors. To social networks entrusted with private and intimate details of the lives of billions of users and e-commerce giants operating globally to dominate multiple markets. At the same time, we see the same corporations and their executives venturing into philanthropy at a pace perhaps not seen since the Gilded Age. Companies like Google and Bank of America have made pledges in support of racial equity and other social justice causes. And corporate responsibility initiatives and other sustainable business practices are coming to the fore. Like the Gateses, scores of billionaires have made the giving pledge to contribute the majority of their fortunes to philanthropy. Now, this shift toward stakeholder businesses hasn't been a straight line. In 1970, some of you may be familiar with the American economist Milton Friedman, who published his now mostly infamous doctrine in the New York Times, arguing that the sole responsibility of a business is to increase its profits and generate value for shareholders. Also known as shareholder theory, this concept has been widely influential in the corporate world and debated in graduate schools and boardrooms across the country. Over the last several decades, and more notably in the last few years, however, attitudes about value have shifted toward consideration of other stakeholders, and that includes employees, communities, and even the planet itself. Increasingly, a company's value is measured not just in relation to financial performance, but also by weighing the impact of its social, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG policies. Let's talk about that. They include environmental criteria, which are use and conservation of natural resources, impact on air and water quality, emissions and waste management, use of hazardous materials, sustainable supply chains and infrastructure. Now, how about the social criteria that more and more businesses are judging themselves by? First and foremost, diversity and inclusion, fair and safe labor standards, pay equity and equal employment opportunity, community relations, and engagement in social justice. And I'm going to talk more about that shortly. How about the G in ESG? Well, that stands for governance again. And those governance criteria include legal compliance and integrity, virtuous business practices, accounting transparency, board diversity, and ethical executive compensation. In combination, these ESG factors create a more robust and holistic picture of a business and its relationship to the wider range of stakeholders impacted by its actions. Sustainable investing is the header under which much of the energy of ESG investing is captured today. Most often used by investors as a strategy for socially conscious portfolio management, ESG ratings help money managers and retail traders to evaluate potential investments. This approach to investing is growing in popularity over the last decade. In fact, the 2020 Trends Report from the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment highlighted that ESG criteria were considered as a factor in $17 trillion of professionally managed assets in 2019 alone. This represents a 42% increase from the previous year. While this year's report has yet to be published, we can only expect that trajectory will likely continue and even be accelerated by attention to the pandemic. Now, aside from professional investors, there is also a growing interest among retail traders as well as non-shareholding consumers to invest or spend their money with organizations aligned to their values. According to a survey from Morgan Stanley, 84% of individual investors want the ability to tailor their investments to their values. Among millennials, this rate rises to 90%. Along the same lines, 85% of individual investors are interested in sustainable investing, and this number rises to 95% among millennials. As millennials continue to amass buying power and Generation Z gains access to retail trading through apps, I know my kids are on Robinhood, ESG sensibilities can be expected to grow even more influential. In addition, the wide majority of investors today think that their investment decisions can drive tangible change. Compared to 2017, when only 58% of individual investors thought their investments could influence climate change, the same study in 2020 had this number growing to 71%. For millennials, the percentage increases to 85%. Emphasizing doing well by doing good, 89% of millennials believe their investment decisions can create economic growth that lifts people out of poverty. Let's talk about corporate citizenship. Many corporate leaders also recognize the importance and value of doing right by their stakeholders. Here are a few examples. Mark Benioff of Salesforce. I've been privileged to know Mark for more than 20 years. And full disclosure, Salesforce is a Rocket Lawyer customer. Well, Mark has been a reliable champion of LGBTQ rights since 2015. He helped to organize a boycott of the state of Indiana when then Governor Mike Pence signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act into law. This boycott cost the state more than $60 million in revenue and led to changes in the law that allowed continued enforcement of local ordinances protecting gay and transgender rights. He stepped up to the plate, Salesforce stepped up at a time when few others would, to pressure states who sought to pass anti-LGBTQ legislation, including Georgia in 2016. Then Governor Nathan Deal was confronted with the decision of whether or not to sign a bill that would have allowed the denial of services, employment, and the use of facilities to others based on an individual's or organization's religious beliefs or practices. Again, Benioff and Salesforce led the charge, this time with the added support of Netflix and the National Football League to successfully pressure the governor to veto the bill. Salesforce continues to support gay and transgender rights by outwardly opposing anti-gay laws in the US and globally, and by supporting internal initiatives to diversify its workforce and supply chain. Here's another example. Rose Marcario, who was the CEO of Patagonia, who stepped down in June of 2020, led that iconic company, wearing some Patagonia today, further into sustainable production processes with initiatives to decarbonize its supply chain and share the intellectual property for its production processes openly so that other companies could more easily adopt sustainable production practices. Under her leadership, Patagonia sued the Trump administration for violating the Antiquities Act of 1906 when the administration reduced the size of the Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monuments by a combined 2 million acres in 2017. She clearly understood that doing right by Patagonia's stakeholders meant protecting the lands and the wildlife that originally inspired the company's creation. Ken Chenault, formerly of American Express, and Ken Frazier of Merck. When the Georgia legislature passed an unjust and undemocratic set of changes to the state's voting law earlier this year, these men joined forces to mobilize dozens of business leaders in the fight against a wave of restricted voting rights legislation. Chenault and Frazier, along with 70 other Black business leaders, including rocket lawyer, investor, and my good friend Bill Lewis, took out a full-page ad in the New York Times to make a statement imploring business leaders across corporate America to publicly oppose discriminatory legislation and any measures that restrict the ability to vote. This action led to a cascade of solidarity from major companies and other leaders across industries. Even conservative business leaders, some, like Republican donor Ken Langone, felt compelled to speak out this January when rioters stormed the U.S. Capitol. Langone, now retired, called the insurrection a disgrace, and he vowed to do his part to help President Biden be the most successful president in the history of his country. And again, this is coming from a conservative business leader. While Home Depot has more recently been criticized for not taking an early stance against Georgia's new voting rights law, Langone's decision to make a public statement about the Capitol riot demonstrated bipartisan leadership in a time of crisis. So building trust. Today, corporate executives are not only beholden to their board of directors, but often to their employees and the general public as well. According to the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer, an individual's employer CEO is the second most trusted societal leader in America, behind scientists. Beyond employees, 86% of all Americans expect CEOs to publicly speak out on societal challenges, and 68% say CEOs should step in when the government fails to solve societal problems. This demand for advocacy and expectation of social leadership creates an opportunity for CEOs and other corporate leaders to be agents of change. Now, as the largest generation in the American workforce, millennials tend to apply the same values that influence their investments to their career decisions. According to a survey by McKinsey, 82% of employees feel it's important for their company to have a purpose, and 72% believe that purpose should have more weight than profit alone. As the individuals holding purpose-driven values are promoted into senior positions, these expectations more likely will continue to become even more prominent. In the last 14 months of economic strife and social unrest, we've all witnessed the power of purpose when it comes to consumers. In a survey done by Porter Novelli earlier this year, 78% of respondents say they were more likely to remember a company with a strong purpose, and 71% said they were more likely to purchase from a purpose-driven company over the alternative when cost and quality are equal. While there are differing opinions on the long-term effects of environmental, social, and governance questions on corporate performance, there's considerable amount of data that indicates a positive impact. An aggregate analysis over 2,000 empirical studies of ESG impact on equity returns found that 63% of findings were positive and only 8% negative. By and large, paying attention to ESG concerns does not seem to detract from financial performance. On the contrary, it bolsters it. Now, while change is happening from within for some organizations, there are also external measures advancing the adoption of ESG standards. Here are a couple. California Governor Gavin Newsom enacted AB 949 last year, which mandates gender and racial diversity on the board of any public company that is headquartered in California. Similar legislation is being discussed across the country, including very recently HR 1277, Improving Corporate Governance through Diversity Act of 2021, which would require public companies to disclose board diversity metrics to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. And new SEC Chair Gary Gensler has expressly indicated his interest in getting more companies to disclose this demographic information. In addition to advancing social ideas and creating an equitable playing field, diversity is shown to improve company performance as well. McKinsey asserts that companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above the national average. And companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 15% the same. Further, there appears to be a linear between financial performance and diversity in your executive team, in which earnings before income, interest, and taxes, EBITDA rise 8% for every 10% increase in racial and ethnic diversity. In addition to important legislative measures, there have also been innovations in technology that support transparency and stakeholder accountability. While there are legitimate environmental concerns related to the amount of energy required in cryptocurrency mining, for example, there are several fundamental characteristics of blockchain that can make it especially useful technology for creating visibility, both for investors and supply chain operators. The blockchain is a public ledger, so any stakeholder has the ability to see transactions, ensure ethical sourcing, and verify sustainability. While blockchain is already being integrated across a number of industries, there are still significant barriers to adoption, creating opportunity, including a lack of widespread technical expertise. However, given the fact that Bitcoin mining currently consumes as much energy as the entire country of Sweden, there's certainly much room for improvement and innovation there. In fact, in an announcement from Elon Musk just yesterday, I believe, the company has reversed its decision to accept Bitcoin, citing fossil fuel usage as a concern. Now, if you're like me, these challenges are exciting entrepreneurial and invention opportunities. Sort of wrapping up, ESG is everywhere in current events. EVs was not a household word until very recently, and today Elon Musk is enough of a cultural icon to have just hosted Saturday Night Live, and there are no fewer than 24 publicly traded EV companies. There was a massive new investment announced last week in offshore wind energy by President Biden off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. More and more traditional companies are also getting an environmental act, with investors, communities, and employees demanding action. United Airlines pledged to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 100%. Amazon has made a similar pledge. Now, what about the pandemic? Right now, without question, ending the pandemic is the most pressing issue worldwide, and for-profit companies have been at the forefront, from developing vaccines to deploying them and encouraging vaccination of all employees. There has been intense debate on the topic of employee vaccination and a variety of approaches to this often politically fraught issue. Many corporate leaders are encouraging vaccination to slow the fourth wave of COVID, yet others have questions on what they can legally require. So I'm going to tell you right now that the law is fairly clear. Employers can mandate vaccinations within certain guidelines and exceptions. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, allows employers to require vaccination if the illness meets the standards set forth in the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, meaning that it must be a direct threat that poses a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by a reasonable accommodation. There are medical and religious exemptions, along with other restrictions that may apply, so it's best to consult an attorney if you're making these decisions. Now, lastly, what constitutes good corporate governance? Every year it seems to evolve. Currently, there's a lot of focus on the role that social media companies like Facebook and Twitter play in elections and other political events. Just this month, Facebook's Oversight Board, which functions like a Supreme Court for content decisions on Facebook and Instagram, upheld the platform's decision to suspend the account of former President Trump. The group, however, also criticized the company for not following consistent standards about the duration of the suspension. Social media companies have also been taken to task over the abuse of their platforms by adversaries like Russia, China, and North Korea, among others. So organizations are emerging with purpose. I truly think that we've never in human history seen such a confluence of technological change, social change, and regulatory ambiguity as today. To address these influences and demands, emerging organizations will need to be built with ESG scaffolding from the ground up and staffed by talented people who combine technical skills and social know-how. Teams will need to be aligned culturally and pointed toward a common North Star. It is that point of shared values that ideally guide the organization to a destination both profitable and positive. Benioff may be right when he says that business is the greatest platform for change. As we emerge into a post-pandemic world, the expectation of corporate social engagement will not recede. Over time, the demands will only become more rigorous. Any company that hasn't taken a hard look at its purpose and place in society will soon find itself struggling to keep up with the new paradigm that promotes ESG values alongside profits. Thanks. I'd be happy to take a question or two. It's a pleasure to have spoken with you.
Thank you so much on this important discussion and information. I'll go to the chat and see if anyone has any questions really quickly. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll definitely ask Charlie more about that. Charlie, I do have one question. You've been in business for a long time. Have you ever seen a time like this? All of the different points that you talked about. Have you ever seen anything like this?
No, that's a great question. I really haven't. I guess the closest I would say in my career was, and it was very early, just coming out of college, would be the anti-apartheid movement. And so back in the late 80s, early 90s, you did see a real, it wasn't started from inside corporations, it was started externally, threats of boycotts, et cetera, that really led companies to start to put pressure on the oppressive regime at that time in South Africa to release Nelson Mandela, to become a majority-led democracy as they have. And much of that pressure ended up coming from the private sector. So I'd say this is the, between environmental issues, climate change, social justice, and certainly governance, diversity, inclusion on boards, et cetera. I'd say it's far beyond even the anti-apartheid struggle today.
Last question. A lot of the attendees are students or they want to be students in graduate business school. So when you think about emerging leaders, what type of training or education do you think is going to be critical for future emerging leaders at this time with all of the various issues that you discussed today?
Yeah, Karen, first of all, I think there's no better training than real life. And so combining, but as you saw, we provided lots of historical references and tried to provide data in the talk I just gave. And so it's a combination of what we used to say, book learning and the School of Hard Knocks. And I think a program that gives students an opportunity to learn in the classroom, but to combine that classroom knowledge and those tools with real world experience through internships, et cetera. We operate an intern program at Rocket Lawyer is probably the best of both worlds.
I would like to thank you for speaking to our attendees today and participating in the Emerge 2021 conference. It's been a pleasure. You gave a lot of great information, and just thank you again.
Thanks for having me.